Welcome to the next in our online conversation series. My name is Paula Gooder and I'm Canon Chancellor here at St Paul's Cathedral, which means that I look after the theology and learning that takes place within the life of the cathedral. And particularly, I am the director of the St Paul's Cathedral Institute. Today, I'm going to be talking to the Right Reverend Dr. Guli Francis-Dehqani, who is the Bishop of Chelmsford. Guli has been a bishop for a number of years, first in Loughborough in the Leicester Diocese and now as Diocesan Bishop in Chelmsford. She first arrived in this country at the age of 14 as a refugee from Iran, and today's conversation will be reflecting on her experiences. Bishop Guli, it's really lovely to be talking to you today.
Thank you very much, Paula. I'm delighted to be here.
So, as we said in the introduction to you, Guli, you came here from Iran, I think at the age of 14. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood before you came to the UK?
Yes, I had a really happy childhood, actually. And to me, of course, it was absolutely normal because it's all I knew. Looking back on it, it was quite unusual. I kind of lived between and betwixt different worlds, I suppose. I was born into a Christian home. My mother had been the daughter and indeed the granddaughter of British missionaries, but she herself had been born in Iran, raised in Iran. My father was a convert from Islam from a small village in the center of Iran. But by the time I was born, he was already ordained. He was Bishop of the small Christian community, Anglican Christian community in Iran. And so at home, life was very much bound up with church, and there were at that point foreign missionaries still in Iran and very active in the life of the church. And home and church life was sort of bound up together. But then once we stepped outside that life, as it were, I was in an entirely Muslim environment. I was at a regular school. I was the only Christian actually in an entirely Muslim school. I grew up with both languages, English and Persian, and obviously the Eastern influences, but the Western influences that came largely through the missionaries. And for the most part, these two worlds coexisted quite peaceably alongside each other. There were kind of moments of tension for the church, but at that period, the strength of central government meant that those who had problems with the existence of this Persian community weren't able to express that in any sort of real meaningful way. So yeah, my childhood was very settled, happy. From time to time, the worlds overlapped. Friends from school would come home. At church, we would have what we called invitational services for local religious leaders, Muslim leaders, and on the whole, relationships were very positive.
And then big dramatic change, and your whole family came over to the UK. Do you want to talk a little bit about what caused the move and also what it felt like when you were uprooted from everything that you knew?
So yes, our lives very suddenly, in a way, turned upside down with the advent of the Islamic Revolution, which kind of swept through the country. Its early signs for me as a child were felt in the summer of 1978, when curfew was introduced. And protests began to become apparent on the streets and so on. I mean, in actual fact, the roots of the revolution go back a long time before. But in my, small little life as a 12, 13-year-old, that's when it started. And then over the course of the following 12 to 18 months, I suppose, dramatic events started to happen around us. As the old regime fell and the new regime came into being, and the sort of chaos of revolution, which meant that there was sort of anarchy, really, and those who had been waiting for their opportunity to attack the church. And the problem was that we are a Persian-speaking indigenous Christian community made up primarily of converts and second-generation Christians. And this is why it's problematic to a certain type of Islam in which conversion away from Islam is both a sin but also a crime. And so early on in the chaos of revolution, it was various events, so raids on offices and our house, the bishop's house. Early on in the revolution, one of our clergy was found murdered in his study. Financial assets were frozen, institutions were either confiscated or closed down. So the church had a number of hospitals and schools and so on. And people began to leave. Certainly foreign missionaries, that was very dramatic. 1 week at worship they were there, and then the next week they weren't. They'd all gone, and suddenly we were aware of how vulnerable we were. My father held responsibilities in the wider Middle East at the time. He was bishop in Iran, but he was also presiding bishop of the province of Jerusalem and Middle East, so he traveled a lot. He had been briefly arrested. There had been an attempt on his life in which he survived, but my mother was injured. But he continued with some plans for traveling to the province. This is in late 1979. And while he was out, the situation became much worse. The American hostages were taken at that point, and any semblance of law and order collapsed at that stage. And so he was advised not to return for the time being. Daily people who were considered to be enemies of the new regime were being arrested and executed, literally on a daily basis. So he was advised not to come back for the time being. The feeling was it was better to have him providing leadership outside the diocese than coming back to what would have been, definite arrest and execution. So my mother came back without him, and life carried on like this for several months. And then eventually in May 1980, my brother, who was lecturing at the university in Tehran, he was 24, and his car was ambushed on his way back from work. Two men, bystanders, eyewitnesses later told us, 2 men got into the car, had a brief conversation with him, and then took out a revolver and shot him, and he died instantly. No one was ever brought to justice, but we've always understood that they had no problem with him, but it was a means of getting at my father, possibly revenge, possibly they thought my father would come back for the funeral. We really just don't know. But at that point, I think my parents were very clear that, again, for the time being, they imagined we would join my father out of the country. So we obviously buried my brother, left within 2 weeks of him dying, imagining that we'd be back home within a few months, maybe a year at the most. Everybody thought that the revolution would blow over, that it wouldn't take root in the way that it has. And obviously that wasn't to be. And so I found myself here I was 13, just about to turn 14. And over time have made a life here, and experienced many blessings along the way as well.
In a moment, I'd like to come back to that theme. But while you were talking, I was struck by your mention of the presence of Christians in Iran. And I wondered if you'd just like to spend a moment telling us about the history of Christianity in Iran, because I think for some people, they won't know about it.
Yes, absolutely. So Christianity has been in Iran from the earliest times, and there are still a number of the ancient churches there. So the Assyrians, the Armenians, and so on. We don't know precisely how Christianity arrived in Iran. So legend has it that St. Thomas, Jesus' disciple, on his way to India to take the gospel there, stopped in Iran, and that was sort of the beginning of it. But what we do know is that by the time of the Council of Nicaea, there was a church in Iran because there was a bishop representing the church from that part of the world. It wasn't known as Iran then, but from that part of the world. Represented the churches at the Council of Nicaea. So there was some kind of organized community there by the 3rd and 4th centuries. And then over time, those communities have continued to develop, and they still have a life there. They very much live within their own communities. They still have their own language, their own worship, and they're recognized as what you might call sort of second-class citizens. They're recognised as people of the book. They have representatives in Parliament currently, and they don't encourage converts. So they live within their own communities. But on the whole, people don't convert to Christianity through those churches. The sort of 18th and 19th century brought the more what you would think of as evangelical Christian mission societies from a number of different places. And one of those was the Church Missionary Society from Britain, from England. And so the Anglican Church in Iran has its roots in that movement and the arrival of missionaries there. And then in 1912, a Diocese of Iran was created, but still under the auspices of the Diocese of London. And it was then in the 1930s that Iran became more of an independent diocese, and then in the 1970s, a part of the province of Jerusalem, Middle East. So as I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, this was a young church community seeking to become a genuinely indigenous expression of Christianity. So slight loosening of the control of the missionaries and more emphasis on raising up local Persian leaders, of whom my father was one. So my father was the first indigenous Persian bishop, but up to that point, they had been always foreign missionaries, as it were. So we were going through a period of change and transformation, and wanting to find an identity that was both fully Christian but also fully Persian, and that remains a challenge, I think, for Persian Christians to this day, how to find a way of coalescing in a healthy way something that is both Christian and Persian.
So fascinating. So let's return to you. Young 14-year-old has arrived in the UK. It must have felt completely bewildering being uprooted, and particularly with the tragedy of the death of your brother. And so the family must have really struggled at that time.
Yes, I mean, it some senses it was. Do you know what? I always feel it's right to say that absolutely we had been through some traumatic experiences. And we didn't know what the future held for us. There was a lot of uncertainty. And obviously, we were away from home and away from the people that we loved. But compared to those who travel for asylum and refuge now to the UK, I think we had quite a soft landing in the sense that the environment into which we came didn't have all the suspicion and political negativity around welcome to refugees that exists now. Added to that, my father was a bishop of the Anglican Communion, and so there was support from within the Church of England. And also we had some family here. My grandmother, my grandparents who'd been in Iran for many years had retired here. My grandmother was still alive. So in some ways there was support around us more quickly than there might have been. But there was a lot of uncertainty, and there was a real sense of displacement and trying to find our feet. And for me as a 13, 14-year-old, that obviously meant adjusting to a completely different environment, coming from sort of revolutionary Iran to British society and finding my way into that, adjusting to school life. My parents, who had no idea what the future held, were very, very keen not to uproot me again, as much as was in their control. So I was sent to a boarding school who offered a full bursary for the missionary children and people who were in situations like me. So, that was just an extraordinary culture shock. And yeah, it did take me time to adjust, but I would say that I experienced an awful lot of kindness, and I suddenly found that I was given opportunities that I had never had, and I sort of lapped these opportunities up. I spoke English, but my English was quite rusty, so it took time to become more confident in speaking English. But suddenly I had not just reasonable academic opportunities, but the sport and the drama and the music, I loved all of that, and I would never have had those opportunities. And I had people who were willing to encourage me, and so they weren't easy years, but when I look back on them, as I say, there were many blessings. And I think I suppose I lost my childhood a little bit earlier than I ought to have done in the ordinary things of ordinary ways of life. But when I look back, I sort of choose to lean into the positives, really. And there were many of those. I think in many senses it was harder for my parents. I think it was very, very painful for my mother sending me to a boarding school. When I look back on it, I think in a sense that was more of a sacrifice for her and for them than it was for me. And it's taught me that children are quite resilient. We worry an awful lot, don't we, about unsettling our children. And my sense is that if you know you're loved, and if there's security in that at home, that actually children are quite resilient. So I consider myself to have been very fortunate, really.
But out of that whole experience, clearly your faith has bubbled along all the way through. And I wonder what reflections you have on your faith today and how much has been shaped by the experience of moving countries, the refugee experience. Would you say that there's a strong strand, or is it kind of less of a strong strand?
Yeah, I think probably it is there quite profoundly and deeply, in some ways consciously, in some ways unconsciously, because we are the sum of our experiences, aren't we? So it can't possibly not be there. So yeah, I have. It has bubbled along steadily in the way that you describe. I mean, I'm often asked, when did you become a Christian? I don't know. I took it in with my mother's milk. I was baptized as a baby, but my faith was very much shaped in those early days by being in a minority community within a wider setting. And then the whole experience and turmoil and the injustices of what the church faced and what we faced as a family. And then I suppose in England, particularly in my formative years, in those late teenage years and early 20s, I mean, without even realizing it, what I was doing was observing my parents and watching how they adjusted, how they remained hopeful and positive, how they sought to be people who were forgiving, who let go of what they needed to let go of in order to be able to move forward well. And I think I took a lot of that in unconsciously. I would say that in my 20s, I made a half-hearted attempt to walk away from faith, but it never really worked. It always kind of pulled me back. There was adjusting to do in terms of church culture. It had been a very, very special, particular church experience that I'd had. It was quite intense in Iran because we were a minority and our lives were shaped by that. Church community was very much cross-generational. Families attended. I had good friends in church as well as at school. Here, my experience was much more difficult to find that kind of church community, and I had to go through a phase of recognizing that in order to move forward well here, I had to let go of some things, and I suppose more in my 30s, late 20s, 30s, a whole process of seeking to find a real sense of belonging. We were in a way outsiders in Iran by virtue of our faith. We were considered to be those who kind of betrayed our nationality. Social and religious identities are very tightly bound together. So, looking back, I think I recognize that we were outsiders there seeking to find a place of belonging. And that's continued here for me. How to find a place of belonging, which means you don't sit on the margins and sort of lick your wounds and feel sorry for yourself and think that nobody understands you, but actually to be able to make a positive contribution and to make peace with everything that's brought me to this stage, the good, the bad, the painful, the joyful, but recognize, and this has been crucial for me, recognize that none of it needs to define who I am going forward, because in Christ Jesus, we always have the possibility of transformation. So that's been an ongoing part of my journey. And I hope that for the most part, I've found a way of being able to contribute whilst being true also to all the things that have shaped me and remain important to me.
And I think, just thinking of the Bible and the importance of migration in the Bible, as soon as you become aware of the theme of refuge and migration, it's all over the place, isn't it? You know, starting with Abraham, moving all the way through into the New Testament. Are there any particular passages that, when you're thinking about your experiences, that resonate more strongly with you?
I don't know. I mean, as you say, profoundly aware of the sweep of the Bible being a story about migration, essentially. I mean, you mentioned Abraham, but actually, arguably goes back to Adam and Eve, and when they have to leave the Garden of Eden. You know, migration has always been part of the story of human beings, and then it takes us right through to the book of Revelation, where then all the nations are gathered around the throne of God and no longer needing to migrate or to find belonging, because we've been sort of swept in to the fullness of God's love at the heart of creation. So I'm really conscious of it as a theme. And I often try to say to people, you know, we think that this is a current challenge to human beings and the world. It's not. It's always been there. I mean, I love some of the stories. I love the story of Ruth and Naomi, for example. But there are so many, it's not possible for me to pinpoint one. And it's all about how human beings find rootedness wherever they are, but also conscious that actually we are all on the move, either physically or spiritually, and sometimes both. And very little separates those of us who have had to move and find refuge elsewhere from those who haven't. You know, a handful of circumstances, unfortunate experiences, or whatever it is, not much separates us. It is a human experience. And the borders that we create are artificial ones. Maybe they're needed for human beings to be able to live well and to have sort of order, to create order out of chaos. But sometimes we over-egg and sort of make idols of the borders in a way that we don't need to.
And I imagine that feels different in a place like Iran than it does in a place like the UK, because in a way we are an island. So therefore our borders are slightly obvious, because if you go beyond them, you tip into the water. Although bearing in mind, we also can celebrate the fact that there is Scotland and Wales. And so we do have some borders, but nothing like the thing I was really struck by when I was in various of the countries of the Middle East is it's a very negligible difference between being in one country and another. It's just a matter of stepping onto another piece of soil that looks very much like the other piece of soil. Does that feel different to you?
Yeah, I think you do have a point there about how people in this country view themselves, their identity, their borders, and so on. I mean, Iran is interesting even within the boundaries that make up current day Iran. That, you know, historically, the people who make up Persians, Iranians today, are various different ethnic groups and tribes, if you like. I mean, it's a very tribal part of the world. So even within the boundary of Iran, it's not entirely clear, you know, who is from which specific ethnic grouping and so on. I mean, that's true to an extent in this country. I think, you know, you get some strong identities, don't you? Yorkshire and Cornwall and places like that. And I think there is a question here for people, which is around what makes what makes English identity or even British identity, I observe that that's quite problematic for some people, and that's to do with the history of this country. So I will often hear people talking much more proudly about being Cornish or whatever it is than they do about being English. I think the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh perhaps are a little bit more comfortable. I think there are challenges for the English, personally, this is my observation, perhaps because of the kind of overhang of post-colonial guilt and all of that. And I think that's partly what we see in the challenges of today, in terms of how can a nation be open and welcoming to newcomers if it's not entirely clear what their own identity is. I think the stronger our own identities are, the more open and welcoming it's possible to be, or it's easier to be. And that's one of the challenges I see at the minute in this country, is that some of what we're seeing is about a desire to gain a stronger sense of what it means to be English. And the borders, the fact that this is an island, maybe that in some ways makes it more difficult. In some ways it should make it easier, work out what our culture is, what our identity is. But I think you're right about the strength that it gives to that sense of, this is our domain, and therefore any who come in are outsiders. You see that in Europe as well, don't you? I mean, I think European culture is quite different to English culture, even though we're all part of the same continent. So it's a very complex thing, and I think it's bound up in our histories and our stories, both as individuals but also as societies.
And you mentioned while you were talking people who want to be welcoming to refugees. And I'm thinking there'll be a lot of people listening who do want to be welcoming. Is there anything you'd like to say to people whose instinct is to be able to welcome people properly?
I think it takes a bit of courage nowadays to do that. So I do want to encourage people and thank them for being willing to be positive and open. On the whole, my observation, my experience when I talk to people is that those who have taken the time and the trouble to get to know asylum seekers or refugees will say that they themselves have gained more than they feel that they've given. Now, I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure they have given an awful lot by way of welcome and opportunities for others to contribute and so on. But I absolutely think it's a two-way street. It is not just about the host community saying, oh, here are people in need, what can we give them? And this is about, particularly if you're talking about church culture and church environment, this is about welcoming newcomers and together becoming a new community. Because I think whenever we welcome newcomers, at its best, we should be open to how that's going to change the status quo in terms of our own culture and so on. So the other thing I observe is that for a lot of people, because I think sometimes people who are in church maybe find it difficult to publicly own the fact that they are challenged by the number of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants coming into this country. And we do need to be able to have open and honest conversations. And we do need to be able to talk about the infrastructure needed in the country to support those both who, have been here many generations, but also those who are coming in more recently. Sometimes I think the temptation is to recognize what the problems are now and then to want to find a place to put the blame. And so asylum seekers become a bit of a scapegoat, when actually they're not the cause of the problem. They're just one group who happen to experience the challenges that we're facing around housing and the welfare state and the NHS and education, all of those things, but they're not the cause of it. And they're a very, very small group, actually, of the people who are experiencing it. So it's very easy at one level. I hear people who will publicly say no more refugees, no more asylum seekers. It's very easy to hold that view generally until you meet individuals. And then you meet individuals, you form relationships, you recognize the story behind the individual, and you see that these are human beings, just like you and me. So the challenge is to to get across the boundaries, to meet people, to put ourselves in situations where we encounter those who are different from us. And then we very quickly recognize all that we have in common. And it draws out the human element from us, of wanting to be compassionate, wanting to be supportive. It's very easy to in general talk about a group in negative terms, but as soon as you break that down to individuals with a story that I know and have a relationship with, I think it has the potential to draw out the best of our human nature.
Thank you. Can I just loop back to Iranian Christians for a moment, because we are obviously talking at a time when there is kind of terrible conflict going on in Iran. If someone were wanting to pray about the situation, and particularly for Iranian Christians, what themes do you think they ought to be thinking about?
Well, I mean, there are the Christians who are still in Iran, of course, who continue to experience, well, both the problems that everybody in the country is facing. So there is a huge economic crisis going on. Inflation is just rocketed sky high. So people are struggling just with daily living. Sanctions continue to have an impact. And then you've got the uncertainty of the war. People are sort of caught between not knowing when the next bomb might drop and an oppressive regime. For the vast majority of people, that the current regime has lost any sense of moral authority, but they rule with a very, very brutal iron rod. So it's difficult to imagine the sort of fear, the uncertainty, and all of that is currently enveloping people in Iran. So that's just anybody, any ordinary person in Iran. For faith communities, there is the added impact of trying to be true to our Christian faith in an environment that is not open to that. The Anglican Church is now so tiny as to be almost humanly negligible. There is still a Diocese of Iran, but they have not had a bishop now for several years, a couple of deacons, and a handful of congregations who are tiny in number, but they are absolutely precious in God's sight, and they are courageous in still being there, and we need to continue to pray for them to have strength and courage. They are holding something there, caretakers of something. One day this regime will change, and the situation will change, and those who are currently still there need all the prayers we can give and offer. There are also, of course, the Anglican Church can no longer baptize new people. That is against the law. It's very dangerous. And so many who are searching and looking for something are forming small underground cell groups. And it's very difficult to get information out about them for obvious reasons. But again, they have to be incredibly courageous. And where possible, they have connections with people abroad who offer some Christian teaching and so on. It's very difficult to know quite what is feeding them in terms of faith. By nature, they have to be small because the risks of being found out are very great indeed. So that's another grouping. And then we've got those who are in the diaspora, those who've either converted in Iran, either through an underground movement or one of the established churches, or indeed those who have come to Christian faith once they've been out of the country, and many of whom have family that they're deeply worried about and getting very little news on, family and friends, people who would love to go back if and when the situation changes, and who are again trying to deepen their Christian faith whilst also working out what it means to remain true to being Persian. These are complex matters that take a lifetime, I think, to work through. So offering support, practical support, and enabling opportunities for people to contribute. This is one of the things I always say. Refugees, asylum seekers need to experience the warmth of welcome, but they also need the opportunity to be able to contribute. And that means those in the host community stepping back and allowing the opportunity for people to bring their offerings, whatever they are. So the opportunity to contribute and to become fully a part of the family of the church here. So there are many different ways in which we can pray and in which we can offer practical support. And of course, there are those who are walking through the asylum system, who are pretty much destitute in this country. And often the local church is the only place where they might find some sense of familial belonging, warmth, welcome, and an opportunity to explore and to be who they are.
You've mentioned the word courage a couple of times, courageous and courage, and it strikingly is the theme of Refugee Week this year. Would you like to talk a little bit about what the word courage means for you in the context of Refugee Week and what people might like to be thinking about in that area?
I think courage is it's connected to perhaps a number of other words, amongst them hope. You know, people will often say to me, or I hear them say to others, "Oh, you're so brave. I couldn't have done what you've done, or I couldn't have been through what you've been through." I suspect that's not true. I think we face the circumstances that life throws at us, or that we find ourselves in, one day at a time. If we think too far ahead, it's too big, and then maybe it becomes unmanageable. So courage enough for today, and hope enough to get me to the next day and the day after. But courage, again, is something that is very difficult to have in isolation. Courage is best placed and held within communities. And again, this is why the community of the church is so important. Practical support, encouragement, strengthening prayer life. But I often feel that courage is something that is more rooted in the day-to-day, leaning into what it means to be faithful today, without worrying too much about tomorrow or 5 years or 20 years time, just today. And we do that best when we do it surrounded by other people, and we carry one another's burdens and we share from our experiences. So I don't know whether that gives enough of a sense of where I'm coming at from.
And very crucially, you used the word hope in connection to courage. So as my final question, I'd like to ask, what gives you hope?
Oh, there is so much to be hopeful for. But again, I think what I want to say about hope is sometimes we think that, hope is something I should just magically feel. It's not. That's optimism. And I don't always feel optimistic. Hope is one of the great Christian virtues: faith, hope, and love. And we know that love and faith have to be practiced in order to be lived. We know that we have to keep on working and developing our faith. We know that we have to work at loving those that we find it difficult to love, and growing in the depth of our love. That's actually true of faith as well. We have to practice it, and we practice it through the depth of faith. We practice it because of who we believe in, because in Jesus Christ, and in what Jesus Christ has shown us of God. As Christians, we believe that God is greater than all the individual things we experience. And that, I love those words of Julian of Norwich, that all things will be well, all manner of things will be well. And I genuinely believe that. We are living our lives at any one point at a very particular time, and we see dimly now, but we also only see a very, very small bit of the scope of eternity. And what counts is our faithfulness day to day, and our willingness to support one another, to carry one another, in the fullness of the hope that there are better days ahead, whilst we continue to be those who work for change and for justice now. That's very important, the now and the not yet. We don't live just for the future. We participate in God's mission to bring the kingdom in more fully now, but we do so in the hope of the kingdom that is yet to come.
That feels like a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Bishop Guli, for your time.
Thank you, Paula, very much indeed.